Thank you. All right. First of all, Asta, thank you for inviting me again after a year. That at least means I survived the year within Australian swimming. I was here yesterday afternoon as well, and had a presentation actually on, because what you just saw wasn't the correct title, a presentation on aerobic capacity and power, and we had some lively discussions there as well, and that's how it should be, because if you look at this picture, this is for me training, or actually this is what is not training. Training is never a one-size-fits-all solution. I would say never trust anybody that tells you this is how your training should be. But I do think as coaches we all get better if we can share our knowledge about training. And this is basically what I want to talk about today, is training anaerobic capacity and power. And more so, actually want to give some examples of how I used the science I had access to. People who were here last year still remember probably that I worked a lot, and my work is a lot influenced by Jan Olbrecht, who was a scientist who I saw monthly and had these lively discussions on training. He did tests for me, and from these tests I worked every month, and then after a month we looked if we achieved our goals. So a big contribution always when I speak is towards him, because I'm thankful that I've been able to work with him that long, and still do actually, because there are some Australian athletes and coaches still working with Jan from a distance, but still as good as it ever was. So what I really want to share today is training anaerobic, so everything without oxygen, but keep in mind the body doesn't work like it's separated, so it's only without oxygen or with oxygen. It always comes together at some stage, but I really want to focus today on the anaerobic part of it, and how I use this science to design my training sets. It's no coincidence that I have capacity there in the picture where the engine is, because that's how I look at capacity. It's how big is your engine, what does your athlete look like, what is the potential of the athlete, and the word potential is there very important. And power is the output. How do you actually use that engine? Because it's great to have a great car, but if you can't drive, you're not going to use that car to the full extent, and that's the same with athletes. You can create a great engine, but if you don't use it to that full extent, it's actually not very useful. Well, to start with, and I did that yesterday as well, I believe with great success, is there anyone, before I start talking about anaerobic capacity in this way, that say, well, I want to stand up and share with all of us an anaerobic capacity set? And to make it easier, talking anaerobic capacity in my terminology, because I'm aware that I'm sometimes using a different terminology than what you're used to, but it's lactate production. So anyone that is willing or wants to share a lactate production set. It's what you do on a daily basis, or at least I think once a week, once every 2 weeks, so it couldn't be that hard. Anyone? 6 200s on 5 minutes as a lactate production set. All right, let's keep that in mind. Anyone else?
850s on 5 minutes.
850s on 5 minutes. You see, two coaches, two very different opinions. So please remember your set. It won't be hard for you to remember this set. Anyone else? It's like an auction here.
475s on 3 minutes.
475s on 3 minutes. Maximum effort. All right. Well, we keep those in mind. The 200s, the 50s, and the 75s. You remember the intervals, and we'll discuss them later after the first part of lactate production. Great. Well, I want to start with actually what is anaerobic capacity. And as I said already, scientifically we express this as VLA max, meaning lactate production. And it's expressed in millimoles per second. So lactate we measure in millimoles in the blood. And how much are you capable of producing in millimoles per second? Or the glycolytic property of the muscle. What I like is the amount of lactate, and more correctly, and we'll get back to that as well, pyruvate, if that's correctly pronounced in English, that the muscle mass potentially can produce per second. So not is producing, but potentially can produce. We're talking about an engine, we're talking about the size of the engine. So actually it's a figure for saying this is what the body potentially can produce in lactate. That's what it is. Then to why do we train anaerobic capacity? Why do we train lactate production? First of all, and I spoke yesterday about aerobic capacity as well. This is the anaerobic side of it. It's a foundation of trainability. So the more lactate you can produce, the higher your VLA max, your lactate production figure, the better an aerobic or anaerobic workload can be afforded. Meaning not must be, but can be. You can imagine if you have a bigger engine, it is easier to digest heavier, slower, longer, more intense workloads than when your engine is very small. Yeah, so that is basically what it's saying. So it's a foundation of trainability. Without, let's say, a big engine, without the ability to produce a lot of lactate, your range of intensity of training gets smaller. And in races, it's important to be able to produce enough lactate, and it's it's one of the key figures that is deciding on how much lactate you actually can produce. So this is basically why we train anaerobic capacity. Of course, different for distance swimmers as for sprinters, and I will get back to that later. It's also beneficial if you want to, let's say, expand and have better aerobic capacity training, because you can play around a little bit more with volumes, you can play around a little bit more with intensities without paying too much for it. Again, if your engine is very small and if you're always driving fast with it, it will wear out significantly faster than when you have a big engine that can have a great load, and it works that way with swimmers as well. So it gives you more training opportunities if you have some extra possibilities in your body to produce lactate, or with your body. Well, who needs to train it? Of course, this is always depending on individual needs, but basically everyone. Yeah, it's important for every athlete in every distance that they can produce lactate. Of course, there is a difference between sprinters and long distance and mid distance, and it always needs to be in balance with the VO2 max. So the higher the VO2 max is, the higher the aerobic capacity engine is, the higher your anaerobic capacity, lactate production, can be. And in terms of race distances, it is if you train for shorter distances, 50, 100, maybe even 200, you can afford a higher lactate production. When more anaerobic or aerobic power is required, of course you need a somewhat lower lactate production, which is logical, of course. Sprinters produce or need to produce more to swim fast than distance swimmers. Well, then very short on what most likely changes in the body if you train anaerobic capacity. And I have to state here that this is generally observed in anaerobic studies, not necessarily always related to lactate production or lactate tolerance, that is the anaerobic power. So we have to be careful with saying, well, this is it exactly. And what you will see, and you see that here, there's still a lot, the higher the intensity gets, the less we actually really know about what's happening in the body. And that's why we're stating like it's most probably based on a biochemical level and enzyme activity and functionality. That's basically all we can say. We can say a little bit more, of course, but that would be the job of a scientist. This for me is sufficiently enough to understand and to start designing sets for anaerobic capacity. If we look at anaerobic capacity, so lactate production sets, what do they have to look like? We're looking at set duration. Well, it needs a minimum of like 3 minutes, a set, not the distance, and a maximum of around 12 minutes. Can also be 2 to 15, but approximately around that area. Way longer will turn out to be a different set. Way shorter won't be time enough to really stimulate that lactate production. Fractions, so what are the distances you can use to train lactate production? Is everything between 20 and 40 seconds, in which 20 seconds might be reasonably short, and 40 seconds in some occasions for athletes might be reasonably long. So very safe to choose for 50 meters. That's the most common thing to do. So let's say around 30 seconds. But overall, you can use some different distances to train lactate production as well. The work-rest ratio is, let's say, work 1, so let's say 30 seconds. Rest 2, let's say 30 seconds to a minute. And it's better to rest passively because the system, if you start working anaerobically and you will go immediately from slow swimming to fast swimming, you're more entering the area of aerobic capacity rather than anaerobic capacity. So the phosphate pool needs to regain to make sure you're staying in this anaerobic zone. Intensity is from nearly max to max, but very important, it's not tolerance. That's why I'm looking at these systems separately. One is production, one is tolerance. So in production sets, it's the aim not to tolerate, but to produce. You're training production, you're not training tolerance. And of course, it's always highly subject to the individual athlete. What are their capabilities? What are their possibilities? What does the body look like to make this work for every athlete specifically? And therefore, you're the coach to figure out what fits, what suits my athlete.
Why is it better to have the rest passive?
Because the phosphate pool, let's say the ATP cycle needs to better, let's say, regains energy when you rest passively. That's why. Yeah, because it's when you keep moving, that system won't regain as much because there's a constant turnover in that. Does that make sense? Yeah? All right. Anaerobic capacity, also because it's 50s, let's say we're talking about 50s, besides 75 and 25s or 30s as well, it is always a great combination and greatly to use in terms with stroke count, stroke rate, stroke length. So efficiency, race pace skills, skills in terms of starts, turns, underwater breaks, finish practice, things like this. Because it is high intensity, there's quite some rest required. So it's great for emphasizing those race-specific skills as well. It's not as aggressive as tolerance, and it's great to do that. That also works the other way around. If you do that, for example, if you swim 50s, stroke count, stroke rate, or race pace, you're automatically, if the rest is sufficient and the set design is what anaerobic capacity looks like, it's automatically anaerobic capacity as well. So be aware of that. If you do 8 turns of 30 meter, let's say on 130, and you do them fast, you're producing lactate. So that's turn practice, but at the same time, it's lactate production as well. And I think it's not just making 8 turns, there's also a physiological reaction to doing these 8 turns. Just want to give you some examples and a set I came across during, I have the privilege to meet great coaches and great athletes in their daily training environment. And sometimes I come across a training and say, well, what is this? This is one of the typical, maybe production is not the right word, but anaerobic sets I came across. 850s on best average, so let's say max, on 3 to 4 minutes, including 50 easy or walk back. And the coach that I'm talking about will recognize this set. But what is it? What is it specifically? Is it capacity, production? Is it speed, maybe? Is it tolerance, or is it everything at the same time? Capacity could be, but only if you can maintain speed. If you can't maintain speed, it is becoming power. Because that's the difference between capacity and power. If it's becoming too tough, it's not capacity anymore. It's not only production anymore. You're shifting towards power training. Not meaning it's a bad exercise, not at all. Again, I'm not here to judge exercises, but it's not capacity anymore. Yeah. So only if speed can be maintained with, let's say, high-level athletes, it could be a capacity training. Is it speed? Well, of course, there's speed involved. If you swim 850s fast, there is speed, but it's not the speed. Let's say if you want to design a sprint session to increase speed, you do something else. Is it power? Well, as stated before, it could be, but then only if the speed can't be maintained. Then it becomes anaerobic power. In a pretty friendly way, actually, but it becomes anaerobic power. And I think, and that's what I want to show in set design, we can make a little bit more clear choices in what we really want, because that's what coaching is as well, making as little mistakes as possible and trying to make clear choices. At least that's what it was for me. Well, make it a clear capacity. Let's say we want to stick to capacity training. I would choose for 50 meter, a push or a dive max. Well, dive not, because otherwise you can't use, let's say, this given for the rest of the set. So a push max. So you ask the swimmers really, push off, swim a max 50. Then 50 easy on 3 minutes. So plenty of passive rest after that. Of course, that lactate still sits in your body after 3 minutes. That's not a problem. After that, you're going to, let's say, lower your pace a little bit. And for distance swimmers, it would be this max you just pushed plus 2 seconds. And again, that's an overall thing. It's not saying distance swimmers have to be plus 2. It can be plus 1, it can be plus 3. But in overall, what you see is that if you ask a sprinter to do this, they will post a very fast time on this first 50. And then for a sprinter, plus 4 is enough to keep producing lactate. For a distance swimmer, who is not that fast, generally speaking, he or she will have enough to do plus 2 seconds. So what you're taking away here is the possibility of having to tolerate lactate, this tolerance thing. So it's a little bit, it's still 850s fast, but redesign of the set, making it more a clear capacity training. If you want to make it a real speed training, well, it's very simple. Make the set shorter, or make the distance, a fraction shorter, go to 25 meters on 2 minutes, maybe 1:30, could be as well, of course. Could also be 3 minutes, so again, it's just examples. But at least it's 25 meters. 25 meters guarantee, or 20 meters, or a combination with 15, 20, and 25 meters, guarantee you stay in the real speed work without producing lactate. Not without exactly, not producing lactate doesn't exist, but there's a big difference between swimming 50s and 25s. And of course you can always finish with a 50 max after the session, no problems. It's not forbidden to produce some lactate, but the focus is really on sprint here. So that's a clear sprint training. If we want to make it a clear power training, so not lactate production, of course you will produce lactate, but shifting into power, you're looking more at broken swim. So you shorten the rest, like 2 50s on 40 seconds. So let's say 15, 10 seconds rest after a 50, broken hundreds. And that, for example, 3 times, 2 times, 4 times, with a longer rest after each set. If you want to do that a little bit more specifically for 200, you can of course do 4 50s on 40 seconds and swim easy after that. So that is typically, and there are more variations, and we'll get to that as well, a more clear power training. So there's, if you want to choose the safe way and say, well, I want a clear capacity training, only lactate production, or clear speed training, or clear power training, there are several options using the same distances, but as a coach you will know for sure, today we've trained lactate tolerance, or today we've trained speed, or today we've trained anaerobic capacity, lactate production. Another set, including skills, for example, 25 with a dive, 10 easy, keep the rest a little bit shorter, let's say to keep the momentum and the lactate in. A 30 with a turn, 15 in, 15 out, on 120, and a 50 from a push, then 150 easy, and again, a little bit longer passive rest as well. Maximum or race speed, a very friendly way of training lactate production, but again, it doesn't need to be tough. If it got too tough, it's not capacity anymore. So this is a bit of a mix between real speed development and lactate production as well. Many other varieties are possible. For example, 4 50s, and a set like that 4 times, starting off in 200 meter pace, so sub-max, doesn't need to be max to produce lactate, on 110. The second set, you involve a little bit more speed, but you're going towards 40 meters, so again, there's lactate production, and you're just going very fast. And the last set, you build up from 200 to 100 pace, or you keep them on 100 back-end speed, for example, just to ensure you're not getting there. You swim max or nearly max, but just not enough to start tolerating this. Yeah? With, again, longer rest after a session to ensure we remain with lactate production and have this passive rest as well. Well, when do we do it in planning? Because with training, it's not only what you do and for whom you do it and why you do it, but also timing for that is important. If we look at planning, for this. And I'd like to think, as a coach, I always have from September through to April, let's say, preparing for trials or age nationals. And I have phase 2 from April through to July, August, preparing for the benchmark event. And basically what you'll see is that ANC, anaerobic capacity, and AC, aerobic capacity, are always in the planning. So if needed, again, it's very individual. There are athletes where you don't want to stimulate lactate production. There are sprinters that you prefer to stay away from lactate production, at least at the beginning of the season, because they produce a lot, maybe even too many anyway. So why bother doing that? And they will have sufficient lactate production if they do their normal sprint sets or an occasional 50 with a stroke rate, or turns or race-based exercises. They will have plenty of lactate production as well. Yeah, meaning it's not forbidden to do it, but why emphasize it if the system is already strong enough to do that? But generally speaking, you do lactate production sets all year round. That's, and again, in the second phase as well, after trials, it's always there. From building, developing the sets, to maintaining to what is necessary. And of course, that is a difference with sprint and distance swimmers, because distance swimmers need a significantly lower lactate production, because their lactate production would get in the way of performing greatly over a 4, 8, or 1500 or 10K. But they need some kind, a certain amount of lactate production to ensure they can train well. So these are different things. And automatically, if you're, let's say, pushing a little bit more in aerobic power, or you're giving athletes a little bit more volume, their aerobic power will go up. Not because you emphasize aerobic power so much, but because lactate production levels will decrease. And a decrease in lactate production always means an increase in power. And this is, let's say, a bit of the art of coaching. How far do you want to go with increasing, decreasing those levels, specifically for each athlete, specifically for each distance?